The man that all of Chicago called the boss could make a nom vanish from every record with a single phone call at midnight. 3 casinos, 2 city blocks, an army in the shadows all under his hand. The FBI had been watching him for 5 years and never once got close enough to touch him. In his world, betrayal meant disappearing. Lying meant ceasing to exist. But one woman had done both right under his roof, right before his eyes, for 2 full years. And the price was not his to pay. The price fell on the shoulders of his 18-year-old sister, the girl he had once sworn to protect with everything he had. That girl was now sitting in the corner of a penthouse on the 47th floor, arms wrapped tight around her knees, eyes wide open yet seeing nothing, as though her soul had fled long before her body could react. Around her, shards of glass lay scattered across the cold stone floor, glittering under the lights like tears that had just turned to stone. And the woman stood in the center of the room, phone pressed to her ear, her voice perfectly level without a single ripple, discussing intake procedures, medical files, a condition requiring immediate intervention. She spoke in the kind of tone people use to book a lunch reservation, not to erase a human being. Then the elevator opened. Heavy footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Stopped at the threshold. A pair of cold gray eyes swept the room, the broken glass, the girl in the corner, the woman holding the phone. 1 second. Just 1 second was enough. He understood everything. And the empire he had built with blood, with iron, with 13 sleepless years crumbled not because of enemies on the streets, but because of the person who slept beside him every night. But before you learn what happened in that single moment, you need to go back in time, to a dark alley on the south side, where an 18-year-old boy held his 5-year-old sister tight in his arms, standing in the wreckage of his own family, and made one single vow. If you believe that true love is not measured by power but by sacrifice, leave a like for this story. Share this video with those who need to hear it. And subscribe to our channel to journey with us through more stories that touch the heart. Southside Chicago, 13 years earlier. The neighborhood where Kane grew up had no place on any tourist map. That night, tragedy came crashing down upon the small house at the end of the alley without warning. Kane was 18 years old, just old enough to sign his name on a legal document, yet not old enough to understand that signature would alter the rest of his life. After that night, his mother was gone, his father was taken away, and he would never return. And Rosie, 5 years old, stood in the ruins of her own family, without understanding what was happening. She knew only one thing. From that moment on, she could no longer speak, not because her throat had been injured, but because something inside her had slammed shut, like a door locked from the inside with no key anyone could find. Kane held his little sister in his arms through the entire first night in the temporary apartment provided by social services. She was so light that he was afraid if he let go, the wind would carry her away. The next morning, a social worker placed 2 choices before him. Let Rosie enter the foster care system, or take legal guardianship of her himself. He didn't need to think. He signed. The pen he used wasn't the social worker's. It was a pen handed to him by a man standing out in the hallway. A man whose name he wouldn't learn until later. The man who would give him his first job just 2 weeks afterward. Darkness had already been waiting at the threshold long before Kane stepped outside. 18 years old, no diploma, no relatives, not a single dollar in his pocket. Rosie needed milk. Rosie needed medicine for the nights when she woke from nightmares and couldn't even scream. Rosie needed a roof that wouldn't leak when it rained. Kane didn't have time to stay in school. He didn't have time to apply for an ordinary job and wait for his first paycheck 30 days later. His little sister needed everything right then, and the underworld was the only place that paid in cash before the night was over. A man on the corner of 63rd Street asked him if he wanted to make money. Kane looked straight into his eyes and said, "I don't care what the job is. I care how much it pays and when it pays." That was the first sentence Kane ever spoke as a man, and it was also the last sentence he ever spoke as an innocent one. 3 months later, he moved out of the welfare apartment and stepped into the first house he had ever bought with his own money. It was small, old, the walls stained a tired yellow, but it didn't leak. He carried Rosie on his shoulders, and she had already fallen asleep in the car. Her hair was a mess, her hand clutched the collar of his shirt, and her lips moved ever so slightly as though she were saying something in a dream that she could never say in waking life. Kane laid his sister down on the new bed, pulled the blanket all the way up to her chin, then sat beside her. The room was silent. The whole world was silent. And in that silence, The 18-year-old boy bent down and whispered into his sister's ear, "I won't let anyone touch you. Ever." Rosie didn't hear him. She was asleep, but that vow didn't need a listener. It needed only the one who would keep it. 13 years was long enough to turn a teenage errand boy from the South Side into a name all of Chicago wouldn't dare speak after 9 o'clock at night. Kane Thornton didn't rise through luck. He rose through precision, through decisions as cold as steel, and through a single principle: never let anyone get hold of your weakness. From an 18-year-old gopher to the man who owned 3 casinos, 2 neighborhoods, and a network the FBI had tracked for 5 years without finding a single breach, Kane built his empire the way men build bunkers, from the inside out, without a single crack. And the man who had stood directly behind him, from the first day until now, was Wade Brogan. Wade was 14 years older than Kane, a former serviceman who had done 2 tours overseas before coming home with 1 ruined knee and not a word of thanks from the government. He met Kane when the boy was only 22, trying to contain a deal gone bad at the South Harbor. Wade was the only man in that room who didn't pull anything from inside his jacket, and he was also the only one who said straight to Kane's face that he was behaving like a child. Kane didn't fire him. Kane hired him. From that moment on, Wade became his right hand, the man who knew every name Kane had erased from the map. The only person who could say, "You're wrong," without having to worry whether he'd still wake up the next morning. But Wade did something else too, something no one in Kane's empire knew, or if they knew, didn't dare mention. He took Rosie to her medical appointments every month. He drove her to school on the days Kane flew to Las Vegas or Detroit. He sat outside the clinic hallway for hours, reading old newspapers, waiting for the girl to come out with her eyes still fixed on the floor and her hands still hidden inside her sleeves. Wade did the things Kane didn't have time to do, or, more truthfully, the things Kane didn't know how to do, because Kane loved Rosie. No one doubted that. He hired the best tutors, the best doctors, security around the clock. The penthouse on the 47th floor had a private room for Rosie, fully soundproofed, with adjustable lighting, everything designed so she would never have to face anything that frightened her. But Kane was rarely home, and when he was, he didn't know what to say to the 18-year-old sister, who sat by the window painting all day and had never once spoken a complete sentence to him. He stood outside her door, looked in, then walked away. Not because he didn't care, but because he was afraid that if he stepped inside, he wouldn't know what to do. And Kane Thornton never allowed himself to stand in a position where he didn't know what to do. One night, after a meeting that ran until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, Kane sat in the car and opened his phone. The photograph Wade had sent him that afternoon, Rosie sitting by the window drawing, her eyes cast downward, no smile. Kane enlarged the image, stared at it for a long time, then turned off the screen. He could control an entire city, but he couldn't make his sister smile. Wade sat in the front seat, watching him through the rearview mirror. "You built her a fortress," Wade said, "but a fortress without someone living inside it is just a prison." Kane didn't turn around. "She's safe. That's enough." Wade was silent for a moment, then asked in an even voice, "Are you sure?" Kane didn't answer. The car rolled through the Chicago night, and that question hung suspended in the darkness between the 2 men. No one touched it, but both of them knew it was there. Every morning of Rosie's began the same way. She woke before the sun reached the window, then lay still in bed for a long time just listening, making sure the penthouse was still quiet, making sure there was no sound waiting outside her bedroom door to attack her. Then she rose and walked barefoot across the warm wooden floor, past the long hallway, past the wide living room where no one had ever sat laughing, and came to the drawing table beside the glass wall overlooking Lake Michigan. This was the only place where she felt allowed to exist without having to apologize to anyone. Drawing table, pencils, blank paper. The world outside was too loud, too bright, too much, all at once pouring into her senses like water spilling over the rim of a glass. When the housekeeper turned on the vacuum cleaner in the hallway, Rosie covered her ears, not because it hurt, but because the sound bored into the inside of her head and wouldn't stop. When someone switched on the ceiling lights in the living room, those harsh industrial white lights shining straight down, she closed her eyes and turned away as though the light were a hand pressing against her face. When the cook made something with too strong a smell, she backed away from the kitchen, then kept backing away until her spine touched the wall. No one explained to her why she was like that, or if someone did explain, she couldn't hear it, because by then she had already gone inside her own inner world, the place where everything was quieter, softer, slower. But Rosie wasn't fragile. What no one realized, not even Kane, was that she noticed everything. She remembered which staff members looked at her with pity in their eyes. She remembered that Wade always knocked 3 times before coming in, and never once forgot. She remembered that every time Kane came home, he stood outside her bedroom door for a few seconds, and then walked away. And the sound of his footsteps leaving was always quicker than the sound of his footsteps coming. She remembered all of it, and she drew all of it. She drew Wade as an ancient tree, roots sunk deep, branches spread wide in shelter. She drew the housekeeping staff as gray clouds, drifting past and disappearing. And she drew her brother. Kane in Rosie's drawings was a tower, tall, steady, impossible to topple. But that tower had no windows, no entrance, no light coming out from within. It was only a solid mass, standing alone in the middle of a white page. One afternoon, Rosie drew a tiny picture, no bigger than a hand, 2 hands holding each other, one large, one small. The larger hand held tightly, as though afraid to let go. The smaller hand held tightly too, but it looked less like it was being kept and more like it was trying to reach. She taped the picture to the refrigerator at eye level, where anyone walking past the kitchen would see it. Kane passed that picture every day. Every morning when he got his coffee, every night when he got water. But he had never once stopped long enough to truly look. He had never realized that it wasn't just a drawing, it was a message. And that message said, "I'm still here. I'm still waiting. But your hand is holding on too tightly while you yourself are standing too far away." The charity gala at the Peninsula Chicago took place on a Saturday night in late November. Kane didn't like events like this. He didn't like chandeliers, didn't like polite laughter, didn't like handshakes that lasted longer than 3 seconds. But he needed to be there. On the surface, Kane Thornton was a real estate investor and the owner of a legitimate casino chain. That surface had to be maintained, and nights like this gala were the stage on which he played the role of the successful businessman before faces he couldn't be bothered to remember. He stepped into the main ballroom in a black 3-piece suit, hair slicked back, gray eyes sweeping across the room with the habit of a man who had spent his entire life judging every exit before he sat down. Wade walked behind him, 2 steps back, exactly as always. Everything unfolded normally, until a slightly drunk guest wandered over and clapped Kane on the shoulder as though they were old friends. Wade's hand moved inside his jacket in an instant, so fast that an ordinary person wouldn't have noticed. Kane gave the slightest shake of his head, only the smallest movement, and Wade lowered his hand. The drunk guest had no idea how close he had just come to crossing a line. No one in the ballroom noticed that moment. No one except a woman standing 10 steps away, a champagne glass in her hand, warm brown eyes fixed directly on what had just happened without blinking. Noelle Ashford, 28 years old, platinum blonde hair cut in a shoulder-length bob, wearing an elegant black dress, just striking enough to leave an impression without drawing attention. She didn't walk over to Kane, didn't try to start a conversation, didn't do any of the things dozens of other women in that room were trying to do. Instead, she disappeared from the main ballroom. Rosie wasn't downstairs. Kane had prepared a private room for her on an upper floor, quiet, softly lit, with a caregiver sitting outside the door. That was how Kane always handled things when he had to bring Rosie to events he couldn't miss. She stayed close enough for him to feel at ease, but far enough away that the outside world couldn't touch her. Noelle found that room. She knocked softly and told the caregiver she wanted to rest somewhere quiet. The caregiver didn't stop her, because Noelle looked like any other upper-class guest seeking refuge from the noise. Noelle stepped inside and saw Rosie sitting at the table, drawing. She didn't say anything, didn't greet her, didn't ask her name, didn't sit too close. She simply pulled over a chair, sat about 2 meters away from Rosie, took a pen from her bag, and began sketching on a hotel napkin. Very badly. Deliberately badly. Rosie glanced over, then glanced again. 10 minutes passed, then 20, and neither of them spoke a word. Then Noelle gently pushed her drawing toward Rosie and tilted her head as though asking for an opinion. Rosie looked at the drawing, then looked at Noelle. She didn't shrink into herself, didn't hide her hands inside her sleeves, didn't turn her face away. For the first time in front of a stranger, Rosie didn't react as though she were being threatened. Noelle spoke, her voice so soft it was almost no more than breath. "You don't need to say anything at all. Sometimes silence is the clearest way to speak." Rosie didn't answer, but she didn't leave either. Downstairs, Kane looked at his phone screen, where the upstairs hallway camera was feeding him an image, a strange woman sitting beside his sister, and his sister wasn't afraid. In 13 years, Kane had hired dozens of specialists, doctors, therapists, tutors. No one had managed to sit beside Rosie for more than 10 minutes without her retreating into her shell. But this woman, whose name he didn't yet know, was sitting there in silence, and Rosie was allowing it to happen. Kane felt something shift inside his chest. In that place he had thought had been sealed in concrete long ago, long before that gala night, long before Noelle Ashford knew the name Kane Thornton. There had been a 12-year-old girl standing outside the door of a locked house. She knocked. No one opened it. And from that night on, the girl swore she would never stand outside any door again, no matter what she had to do. After the gala, Kane said to Wade, "Find out about her. Everything." It took Wade 2 days. He laid the results on Kane's desk on Monday morning. "Her background is clean," Wade said. Then he added, "Too clean." Kane looked at him. "You suspect everyone." Wade's expression didn't change. "That's why you're still alive." Kane pushed the file aside. He called Noelle Ashford and invited her to dinner. Noelle declined. Politely, gently, without a trace of regret in her voice. That was her opening move. And it was perfect, because Noelle understood something very few people understood. For men like Kane Thornton, the most valuable thing in the world wasn't what they already had, but the one thing they couldn't buy. 6 months later, Noelle Ashford had become an indispensable part of Kane Thornton's life. The way air becomes so essential that people forget they are even breathing it. She knew when to speak and when to remain silent, knew when to touch Rosie's shoulder and when to keep 2 steps of distance, knew when to smile and when to let her face turn serious. She was so perfect that Kane forgot one thing. He, of all people, after 13 years in a world where everyone wore masks, should have remembered better than anyone else. Perfection is the most suspicious thing in the world. The wedding took place in an old church on the Gold Coast on a late spring afternoon. No media, no cameras, only the closest faces Kane trusted enough to invite into the same room. Wade stood at the back, expressionless, eyes sweeping across each guest as though he were taking inventory of every weapon in the room. Rosie stood beside her brother, holding no flowers. Her hand gripped a small paintbrush, the only thing that made her feel calm in a crowd. When Kane slipped the ring onto Noelle's finger, Rosie lowered her eyes to the brush in her own hand, and no one knew what she was thinking. Perhaps she didn't know, either. She only felt that something was shifting, as though the ground beneath her feet had tilted ever so slightly, not enough to make her fall, but enough to throw her off balance. In the first week after the wedding, Noelle proposed the first change. She sat beside Kane in the living room, her voice gentle, reasonable, without a trace of strain. "You built a fortress for your sister," she said, "but don't turn it into a prison. She needs space to feel normal." She was talking about the cameras. 14 cameras inside the penthouse, watching every corner, every hallway, every room except the bedrooms and bathrooms. Noelle wanted them all turned off. "I want this to be a family," she said, looking straight at Kane. "Not a headquarters." Kane hesitated, but he looked at Rosie and thought of the times she passed in front of the cameras and lowered her face, as though she knew she was being watched, and that knowledge made her fold inward a little more. He agreed. The cameras inside the home were shut off. Only the gate and the outer hallways remained under surveillance. In the second week, Noelle proposed the second change. This time, she placed a stack of legal papers on the table. Shared guardianship of Rosie. "If something happens to you while you're away," she said, her voice carrying just enough worry to sound real, "I need the legal authority to protect her. If she has an episode, if she needs to be taken to the hospital urgently, I can't be left standing outside because I don't have the paperwork." Logic. Reasonable. Impossible to argue with. Kane had lived long enough in a world where every agreement had another side to it. Yet he looked at Noelle and saw the woman who had sat in silence beside his sister when no one else could. He signed. Wade learned about both decisions that evening. He stood in Kane's office, back straight, face unchanged, but his voice carried more weight than usual when he said, "Turning off the cameras is blinding yourself. Sharing guardianship is handing over a knife." Kane looked at him. "She's my wife, not my enemy." Wade said nothing more. He knew that once Kane had decided, no words would turn him. But as he stepped out of the room, Wade paused at the door for a second. turned back, and looked at his boss sitting behind the desk with the new wedding ring on his finger. And in that second, for the first time in 13 years of working beside him, Wade Brogan felt fear. Not fear of enemies, not fear of the FBI, but fear that the smartest man he had ever known had just opened the door with his own hands and let something step inside that he couldn't see. 3 months after the wedding, Kane received a call from Las Vegas. There was a problem in the system that required him to handle it personally, the kind of problem no one else had enough authority to decide. 2 weeks, they expected. On the morning he left, Noelle stood at the door, wrapped her arms around her husband, and in a gentle voice reminded him to eat on time, to get enough sleep, to call Rosie. She said exactly the things a good wife would say, in exactly the tone a good wife would use, and at exactly the moment Kane most needed to hear them. Rosie stood behind them, a few steps back from the door, one hand clutching her own sleeve. She didn't move closer. She only stood there, looking at her brother, and in her eyes there was something Kane didn't have time to read. He patted his sister's shoulder, said he would video call every night, then stepped into the elevator. The elevator doors closed, and the atmosphere inside the penthouse on the 47th floor changed immediately, as though someone had just switched off the gentle background music and turned on an entirely different frequency. Noelle turned back, looked at the staff lined up in the hallway, and the smile vanished cleanly from her lips. "Starting today," she said, her voice not loud but every word as clear as if carved into stone, "everything in this house will be done the right way." In the first week, Noelle fired the 2 longest-serving employees. Mrs. Hernandez, the housekeeper who had worked there since before Kane bought the penthouse, was dismissed for failing to meet the new standards. Mr. Gallagher, the evening caregiver, was replaced for being unprofessional. Both of them were people Rosie knew, faces she wasn't afraid of, footsteps she recognized in the hallway without needing to look. Noelle replaced them with new people, younger, knowing nothing about this house, knowing nothing about Rosie, and most importantly, needing the job badly enough not to ask questions. June was one of them, 22 years old, newly graduated, needing money to send home to her younger brother, who was still in high school in the suburbs of Milwaukee. She took the job without asking much, because the salary Noelle offered was twice the market rate, and June wasn't in any position to refuse. In the days that followed, Noelle set new rules for Rosie. No drawing after 8 o'clock at night, no leaving her room without permission, no speaking to the staff except when necessary. Each time Rosie failed to obey, there was no shouting, no explosion of anger. There was only Noelle's voice, low and even, cold as the stone beneath one's feet. "Do you think your brother will always be here? He has an entire world out there. You're only a small part of it." Rosie didn't answer, not because she didn't understand, but because she understood far too clearly. Then one afternoon, while Rosie was sitting at her drawing table, the only place where she still felt permitted to exist, a sudden noise burst from the kitchen. The kind of sound Rosie feared more than anything else in the world. The kind of sound tied to the night she lost her mother, the night she stopped speaking, the night everything shattered and was never put back together the same way again. Rosie stood frozen in the middle of the room, eyes wide open but fixed on a place very far away, a place no one in this room could reach. Her body was here, but she wasn't. She had left, fled into the only safe place she knew, where sound didn't exist. Noelle stood a few steps away, watching. She didn't run to her, didn't call Rosie's name, didn't panic. She quietly took out her phone and made notes, her fingers tapping the screen with the concentration of someone collecting data, rather than witnessing a human being sinking under the surface. That evening, Noelle sent Kane a video. In it, Rosie sat at dinner, quiet, normal. Another video. Rosie drawing by the window, the light of evening falling through her hair, making her look almost peaceful. Kane watched the videos and let out a breath. Everything seemed fine. He didn't know those clips had been filmed in the rare moments when Rosie was still calm enough to look normal, and that they had been chosen with the same care people use when selecting an angle to hide the cracks in a wall. That night, when Noelle entered Rosie's room and took away all her drawing pens, pencils, paper, everything, Rosie sat on the bed and watched her carry each item away, without being able to do anything. The only language she had was just taken from her. But after Noelle walked out and shut the bedroom door, Rosie sat still for a long time. Then she reached beneath the bed, pulled out the old teddy bear she had slept with since she was 5 years old. and tucked deep inside it a small pencil she had hidden earlier, the only pencil Noelle hadn't found. She gripped the bear tightly and held it to her chest, and in the darkness of the room, that pencil inside the stuffed animal was the only thing keeping her from disappearing completely. Out in the hallway, June stood pressed into the corner of the wall, one hand gripping the mop handle, her heart pounding fast. She had seen everything. She didn't know what to do. She only knew one thing. Tonight, when she returned to her room, she would open her notebook and write down the date, the time, and what she had just seen. Because June had a younger brother, and every time she looked at Rosie, she saw her own brother. 2 weeks after Kane left, Noelle took Rosie to a private psychiatric clinic on the north side of Chicago. The clinic was on the 12th floor of a glass building, with a waiting area carpeted in thick pile, warm yellow lights, and a faint lavender scent drifting from a diffuser on the reception desk. Everything had been designed to make people feel safe, but Rosie didn't feel safe. She sat in the waiting chair with her hands hidden inside her sleeves, eyes lowered to the floor, shoulders curved inward as though she were trying to take up as little space as possible in this world. Noelle sat beside her, one hand resting on Rosie's shoulder. To anyone watching, nothing would have looked wrong. It was only a woman caring for her husband's younger sister, seeming deeply attentive, deeply patient. But that hand held just a little too tightly. And the person who noticed was Maeve Calloway. Maeve was 27 years old, the intake nurse for the afternoon shift, wearing soft-soled shoes that made no sound on the carpet. She spoke little, kept her word, and had one rule she never broke: never touch a patient without permission. That rule wasn't in any textbook. It came from personal experience, the kind of experience no one wants to have. 11 years earlier, Maeve had been 16 when her mother dragged her into a clinic not much different from this one and told the doctor, "My daughter has a problem." Maeve took medication she didn't need for 2 years, until a stranger told her the sentence her mother should have said, "There is nothing wrong with you." That was why Maeve did this work, not because she was noble, but because she wanted to stand between people who were being mislabeled and tell them they weren't crazy. The first time Maeve met Rosie, she didn't come closer. She simply said from the other side of the room, "I'll be here. If you need anything, tap on the table twice." Then she sat down, did her work, and let Rosie grow used to her presence in Rosie's own way. No pressure, no questions, no staring. While waiting for the doctor, Maeve observed. She noticed something that perhaps no one else had noticed, or no one else wanted to notice. When Noelle left the room to make a phone call, Rosie's shoulders dropped, her breathing slowed, her hands slipped free of her sleeves. She looked like a cord that had just been loosened, but when Noelle came back, everything tightened again. Curved shoulders, hidden hands, lowered eyes, as though someone had just turned an invisible screw. Maeve wrote in her personal notebook, not in the hospital record, "Patient relaxes when guardian is absent. Abnormal sign." At the second appointment, Maeve placed paper and colored pencils on the table, something she did out of habit with every young patient. Rosie picked up a pencil and drew for 30 uninterrupted minutes. The picture was no bigger than a hand, a bird standing inside a cage. But the cage wasn't made of iron. The cage was made of glass. Transparent. The bird could see the sky, see the clouds, see the trees. It could see freedom, but it couldn't touch it. Maeve lifted the drawing, looked at it for a long time, and understood. She understood because she had once been that bird herself. She kept the drawing. Noelle didn't know. After the third appointment, Maeve knocked on the office door of the clinic's chief physician. She placed the drawing on his desk and explained what she had observed, her voice trying to stay steady even though she knew she was trembling. The doctor looked at the drawing, looked at Maeve, then leaned back in his chair. "You want me to suspect Kane Thornton's wife based on a drawing?" Maeve swallowed. "I don't suspect his wife. I'm worried about my patient." The doctor shook his head. "The Thornton family is this clinic's biggest client. Mr. Thornton funds the entire third floor. You're a nurse, not a detective. Know your place," Maeve was warned. The following week, she was transferred to another shift. Noelle requested a different nurse for Rosie for a simple reason. That nurse makes her uneasy. Maeve lost access to Rosie. She put the drawing of the bird into the drawer of her desk, closed it, and felt that drawer become heavier than anything she had ever carried. But the story didn't end there. A week later, Wade brought Rosie to the clinic because Noelle had an appointment she didn't explain. Wade sat outside in the hallway, his back against the wall, one leg stretched out, reading an old newspaper while he waited. Maeve walked past, stopped, and brought him a glass of water. They didn't say much. Wade wasn't the kind of man who spoke much, and neither was Maeve. But before Rosie came out of the examination room, Wade looked at Maeve and asked in a low voice, not loud, but with weight in every word, "The girl, is she really all right?" Maeve hesitated. She looked at Wade, looked into the eyes of a man who had lived long enough to know when a question didn't need an answer and when a question was everything. She said nothing, but her silence said more than any answer could have. Wade pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket, wrote down a phone number, and set it on the chair beside the glass of water. "If anything's wrong," he said, rising to his feet and folding the newspaper. "Anytime?" Then he left, leading Rosie back to the car, and Maeve remained standing in the hallway with the slip of paper in her hand, not knowing that the small piece of paper, with 11 digits written in blue ink, would change everything. That night, when the penthouse had sunk into darkness and Noelle had closed the door to her own room, Rosie lay in bed with her eyes open, staring up at the ceiling. She couldn't sleep. She rarely could sleep now that Kane was gone. At night, the house made sounds she didn't hear during the day. The low hum of the air conditioning, the faint complaint of pipes inside the walls, the wind slipping through the window seams on the 47th floor. Every sound made her hold her breath for a beat, waiting to see whether it would turn into the thing she feared. Then, when she was certain everything was still, she sat up, gently, slowly, the way a small animal moves when it knows a predator is nearby. She reached beneath the bed, took out the teddy bear, and pulled from inside it the little pencil she had hidden away since the night Noelle took everything else. The pencil was shorter than her little finger, the tip worn down, but it could still write. And for Rosie, the fact that it could still write was enough. She tore a page from the book on her bedside shelf, turned it over, and began to draw. The picture was no bigger than a hand, 2 people standing side by side before an open door, one tall, one small. Beyond the doorway was darkness, thick and dense, with nothing visible inside, but the 2 figures were facing the door, not running, not stepping back, only standing there as though they were preparing to walk into it together. Rosie held the drawing and looked at it for a long time, then rose and walked barefoot through the dark hallway to Kane's bedroom. The room was empty. No one had slept in that bed since the day he left. She lifted the pillow, slipped the drawing beneath it, then placed the pillow back exactly where it had been. She stood there looking at the pillow for a moment, then returned to her own room, her footsteps so light that even the wooden floor didn't have time to answer back. It was the only way she knew to tell her brother what her mouth couldn't say. She only needed him to come home. She only needed him to see. But Kane hadn't come home yet, and the one who saw it first was Noelle. The next morning, Noelle noticed the faint smudge of graphite on Rosie's fingers as the girl sat eating breakfast. She didn't ask about it. She didn't need to. She simply went into Rosie's room, found the teddy bear, turned it over, pulled out the last small pencil, and held it between 2 fingers as though it were a strand of hair caught on a sleeve. "Too much drawing isn't good for you," Noelle said, her voice flat and level, smooth as the surface of a frozen lake. "You need rest. Your brother would agree with me." Rosie sat on the bed, watching the pencil in Noelle's hand disappear through the doorway. She didn't cry. She had forgotten how to cry a long time ago, but her eyes then were empty in a different way. Not empty from fear, but empty because the last thing she had still managed to keep had just been taken from her. Her last voice, even if it was nothing more than a worn pencil shorter than a finger, was gone now. That was the cruelest moment. Not the noise, not the rules, but the silence being forced down on her one more time, upon a girl for whom silence was already all she had. That afternoon, Noelle called the chief doctor at the clinic. She spoke of a worsening condition, of concerning signs, of the possibility of needing transfer to a long-term care facility. She attached videos showing Rosie curled into the corner of a room, moments when the girl slipped away from reality, presenting them as medical evidence rather than the result of what Noelle herself had caused. She built a file on Rosie the way people build a coffin, one board, one nail at a time, carefully and patiently, so that when the lid was finally closed, there would be no way out. But Noelle made one small mistake, and she didn't know it. While making the call in the kitchen, she left her phone unlocked on the stone counter, then stepped out onto the balcony so she could speak more clearly. June was wiping down the table. She saw the lit screen. She hadn't meant to look. She knew her place in this house, knew that staff like her weren't supposed to see what didn't belong to them. But her eyes skimmed across the screen, and she saw a name she didn't recognize. Morello. Beneath that name was a message she only had time to read a few words from before the sound of Noelle's footsteps came back in from the balcony. Admission file. June pulled out her personal phone, snapped a photograph of the screen in less than 2 seconds, then slipped her phone back into her apron pocket and kept wiping the table as though nothing had happened. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was beating so fast she was afraid Noelle might hear it. She didn't know who Morello was. She didn't know what admission file meant in this context. But she understood that something was wrong, terribly wrong, and that the photograph now sitting in her phone might be the most important thing she had ever touched in her life. Noelle chose the 12th night since Kane had left. She had waited long enough. The file was ready. The doctor had been prepared. Everything had been arranged down to the smallest detail, the way people prepare for a play that will be performed only once. That afternoon, Noelle sent the staff home early. All of them. June was the last to leave. She stood at the service door and looked back down the hallway one more time, her stomach tightening with a sense of dread she couldn't put into words. But she had no right to stay. She stepped out, the door closed behind her, and the penthouse on the 47th floor became a place with only 2 people in it, Noelle and Rosie. No cameras, no witnesses, no one. Rosie was sitting in her room, on her bed, holding the hollow teddy bear, the bear that now held nothing hidden inside it anymore. She sat in the dark because she preferred darkness to light, because darkness was quieter, because darkness didn't demand that she react to anything. Then the bedroom door opened. Noelle stepped inside, and a loud sound split the air. The sound Rosie feared more than anything else in the world. The sound that 13 years earlier had taken her mother, taken her voice, taken the largest part of her childhood. That sound was now in her room, tearing open the safe darkness, tearing open the silence she had been clinging to, and crashing over her like a wall of water. Rosie folded into herself. She slid down onto the floor, her back against the side of the bed, both arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her eyes open wide but seeing nothing. She wasn't here anymore. Her body was sitting on the bedroom floor of the 47th floor in Chicago, but she herself had gone, fled into the deepest place inside her, where sound couldn't reach, where no one could reach. Noelle stood there and watched. Then she stepped out of the room, picked up her phone, and called the clinic. Her voice was calm, even, not a trace of panic in it, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this call many times in her head before making it. She spoke of an emergency condition, of a severe episode of instability, of the need for immediate admission tonight. She recited Rosie's file number from memory, without needing to look at a single document, because she had known it by heart for a long time. The clinic took the call. The emergency intake procedure was activated. They needed the night nurse to prepare a room, but the primary nurse on duty that night had called in sick. The phone rang in the backup staff room, and the one who answered was Maeve Calloway. The voice on the other end read out the patient's name. Rosalie Thornton. Emergency admission requested by guardian. Maeve heard that name, and the world around her paused for a beat. She set the phone down, opened the drawer of her desk, and looked at the drawing of the bird in the glass cage that she had kept for weeks. The bird could see the sky but couldn't touch it, and now someone was preparing to close the very last door. Maeve looked at the drawing for 3 seconds. Then she pulled from her pocket the small slip of paper Wade Brogan had left on the chair in the clinic hallway. The paper she had carried in her pocket every day since then, not knowing why, only knowing that she couldn't throw it away. She dialed the number. Wade answered after 2 rings. "You need to get her brother home," Maeve said, her voice shaking but not weak. "Right now. Tonight." Wade was silent for 1 second. "What happened?" "I've stayed silent too long already," Maeve said. "Don't make me stay silent one more night." Wade ended the call. He stood in his apartment on the west side of Chicago, staring at the phone screen, his thumb hovering over Kane's contact. He knew that once Kane heard what was happening, the man inside him, the man who had built an empire through decisions no one else would even dare to imagine, would want to deal with everything the way the underworld deals with things. And if that happened, no one would be able to stop him. But if Wade didn't call, Rosie would be taken out of the house before sunrise, taken to a facility she hadn't chosen, imprisoned inside a system her guardian had signed her into in her place. And by the time Kane returned, his sister would no longer be there. Wade made the call. Kane answered immediately. because Kane always answered when Wade called, even at 3 o'clock in the morning. "It's not an enemy," Wade said, his voice even and steady. "It's not the streets. It's your home. Come back now." Silence. 1 second. 2 seconds. Wade heard Kane's breathing change, heavier, deeper, like the sound of a machine shifting into another mode. "But you need to keep your head cold," Wade added, because he knew that sentence mattered more than all the rest. "The girl needs her brother, not the boss." Kane hung up without saying a word. 40 minutes later, a private jet lifted off from Las Vegas airport into the night, cutting through the darkness toward Chicago. On the plane, Kane sat alone, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his hands clasped together, and the wedding ring on his finger gave off a cold glint beneath the cabin lights. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but he knew that Wade had never once said, "Come back now," in 13 years. And if Wade was saying it now, then something in the world Kane had built was collapsing in the very place he had believed was safest of all. The plane touched down at 4:43 in the morning. Kane didn't wait for a car to come for him. He walked straight out of the airport, got into the black SUV Wade had already prepared at the gate, and didn't say a single word during the 20-minute drive through a sleeping Chicago. Wade sat behind the wheel, silent as well, because he knew the kind of silence filling that vehicle wasn't the kind that needed to be filled with words. This was the silence of a man drawing everything he had into a single point, and that point was aimed at the 47th floor of the building ahead. The elevator opened at 5:11. Kane's footsteps sounded across the marble floor, heavy, steady, one after another, like a countdown. He stopped at the threshold of the living room. His gray eyes swept the room, and everything he saw carved itself into his memory more deeply than any contract or any sentence he had ever read. Shards of glass on the floor, glittering under the spill of hallway light like someone's tears dropped and abandoned. The room was empty. No staff, no cameras, no sign that anyone had tried to help. And in the corner of the room, her back against the wall, both arms wrapped tightly around her knees, Rosie sat there. Her eyes were open wide but saw nothing. Not her brother, not the room, not anything belonging to this world. She was somewhere else, somewhere she had fled hours earlier, and she had not come back. Kane stepped over the broken glass on the floor, moving slowly, one step at a time, not because he was calm, but because he was afraid that if he moved too fast, Rosie would retreat even deeper into the place where he couldn't reach her. He lowered himself to the floor, half a step away from her, and didn't speak, didn't touch her. He simply sat there and waited. 10 seconds, 30 seconds, 1 minute. Then Rosie realized he was there. Not through her eyes, because her eyes were still fixed on someplace very far away, but through her nose. Kane's scent, sandalwood and leather, the scent she had breathed in every time he carried her on his shoulders through those first years on the South Side, the only scent in the world she connected with the word safe. Her eyes moved, slowly, very slowly, like someone rising from the bottom of deep water. She turned her head. She saw him, and her hand, the hand that had clutched her knees for hours, slowly released, lifted, searched for Kane's sleeve, and found it. She gripped it tightly. So tightly that her knuckles turned white, tightly as though she feared that if she let go, he would step into the elevator and disappear for another 12 days, and this time, she would not survive it. Kane didn't say anything. He laid a hand on his sister's head, gently, then gathered her into his arms. The 18-year-old girl in his embrace felt as light as she had when she was 5. And in that moment, 13 years collapsed into nothing, and he was once again the boy on the South Side, with his sister on his shoulders, swearing he would protect her at any cost. Only this time, the danger hadn't come from outside. He rose to his feet, Rosie still clinging to his sleeve, and turned toward the woman standing in the middle of the room. Noelle was there, phone set aside now, spine straight, face composed, with the self-possession of someone who had prepared an explanation for every possible situation. She had an episode, Noelle said, with just enough worry in her voice. Her eyes widened just enough. I was only calling the doctor. You know how she reacts. Kane looked at her. He didn't shout, didn't break anything, didn't lunge. That wasn't how Kane Thornton showed danger. His danger lived in stillness, in a voice that never rose or fell, in cold gray eyes that looked straight into another human being and read every line in that person's mind, the way one reads print on a sheet of white paper. He looked at the glass on the floor. He looked at the empty room. No staff, no cameras. He looked into Rosie's bedroom and saw the bare shelf where her drawing supplies had once been. Every piece slid into place, one by one, slowly and precisely, the way he had fitted together thousands of pieces in the underworld over the past 13 years. And when the final piece dropped into position, he understood. He understood everything. "Step out of this room," Kane said. His voice was low, even, not louder than ordinary speech, but every word weighed like lead. Noelle didn't step back. "You're overreacting. She needs professional care. I'm only doing what's best for." "The only person who needs to leave this house," Kane cut in, his voice not changing by a single note, "is you." Silence. The kind of silence that even a 400-square-meter penthouse couldn't hold. Wade stepped out from the hallway behind them, and he wasn't alone. 2 other men came with him, faces Noelle had never seen, men whose existence she had never known about, because they appeared only when Kane needed them to appear. Noelle looked at Wade, looked at the 2 men behind him, and for the first time, the composure on her face cracked. Not much, only a flicker, at the corner of her eyes, at the edge of her mouth, but enough for Kane to see it. And in that moment, he knew he had been right. Noelle walked out of the room not because she accepted defeat, but because she had no choice. No shouting, no threats, only the sound of Noelle's footsteps on the marble floor, the closing of the elevator doors, and her disappearance from the 47th floor, like the last poisonous wind dissolving before dawn. Rosie still held on to Kane's sleeve. All night she didn't let go. She didn't cry, because she had forgotten how to cry 13 years earlier, but her hand held tight, and that was how she said what her mouth could not say. "Don't go again. Don't ever go again." Kane sat beside his sister until the first light of the new day came through the glass. Then he saw it. On his bed, beneath the pillow no one had touched for 2 weeks, a corner of white paper showed through. He drew it out carefully, and the small drawing, no bigger than a hand, lay in his palm. 2 people standing before an open door, one tall, one small, darkness beyond the door, but they were standing side by side. Kane looked at the drawing, and he understood. His sister had tried to speak to him, in the only way she knew how. She had sent him a message and waited for him to read it, and he had not been there to read it. He folded the drawing carefully, gently, as though folding something that might break if he used too much force. Then he slipped it into the breast pocket of his shirt, directly above his heart, the place where it would remain for a very long time. The next morning, Rosie was taken to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, not under the papers Noelle had prepared, not under the emergency admission file the private clinic had standing by, but under a protective order, signed by Kane himself, with the team of lawyers he had summoned before the sun had fully risen. When the car stopped at the hospital entrance, Rosie was still holding on to her brother's sleeve. She had held it from the night before until now, and Kane didn't pry her fingers loose. He got out of the car with her, walked beside her through the white hallways, and when the intake nurse asked whether he wanted to wait outside, he only gave her a look, the kind that needed no words attached to it, and the nurse pulled another chair into the room. The person assigned to Rosie's care was Maeve Calloway. When Maeve saw the name on the new patient board, she stood still for a moment outside the door, drew in a long breath, and then stepped inside. Rosie sat on the hospital bed, small against the white sheets, her eyes still lowered, her hands still hidden inside her sleeves. But when Maeve pulled up a chair and sat 2 meters from the bed, exactly the distance she had always kept, Rosie glanced up, only for a moment. But in that moment, Maeve saw something she had never seen back at the private clinic. She saw recognition. Rosie remembered her. While Rosie was beginning to adjust to the new room, on another floor in the city, Wade Brogan was doing the work he did best, turning over every stone and seeing what lay beneath it. He started with June. The young staff member had been waiting for this call ever since the night she saw the unfamiliar name on Noelle's phone. When Wade contacted her, June didn't hesitate. She handed over everything, the notebook with dates and times, the photograph of Noelle's phone screen, and everything she had witnessed over the past few weeks in the penthouse that no one had ever asked her about. Wade sat in his car, turning through each page of June's notebook, reading every line of handwriting, shaky but clear, then opened the photograph on the phone. The name glowed on the screen, Morello, and beneath that name, the message June had managed to capture, admission file. Wade stared at that name for a long time. He didn't need to look it up. He knew who Vince Morello was. Everyone in the Great Lakes underworld knew Morello, the Detroit boss who had lost millions when Kane pushed his territory eastward 5 years earlier. Morello wasn't the kind of man who forgot. He was the kind of man who waited. And now Wade understood how he had been waiting. Wade went to the hospital to see Kane, drew him out into the hallway, shut the door so Rosie wouldn't hear, and placed June's phone in Kane's hand. "She isn't a lone wolf," Wade said, his voice low and even. "She's prey released into the cage by another hunter." Kane looked at the screen, looked at the name, looked at the message, and for the first time in many years, Wade saw something he had hoped never to see. Kane lost control. Not lost control in the sense of shouting or smashing things, but lost control in a far more dangerous way. His gray eyes darkened, his jaw locked tight, and his whole body went still with the kind of stillness of a bomb counting down. "I'll burn everything he has to the ground," Kane said, and it wasn't a threat. It was a plan. Wade stepped forward, standing directly in front of him, blocking his line of sight. "You burn him down?" Wade said, his voice neither rising nor falling, but every word chosen with the care of a man diffusing an explosive. "You burn yourself down too. And who'll stay with the girl?" Kane didn't answer, but his jaw eased, just a little, enough for Wade to know the words had struck exactly where they needed to. Wade went on. He laid out before Kane the full picture he had pieced together from June's evidence, from what Maeve had told him, from his own sources in the underworld. Noelle wasn't simply an ambitious woman. She was Morello's partner. Their agreement was as clear as any business contract. Noelle provided inside information about Kane's operations, his weaknesses, his schedule, his security systems. At the same time, she would remove Rosie from Kane's life, place the girl into a long-term treatment facility, and sever the only emotional thread that kept Kane tethered to the human part of himself. Once Kane weakened from within, Morello would strike from outside. In return, Morello guaranteed Noelle financial security, no matter how things ended. She hadn't bet on Kane. She had bet on his collapse. When Wade finished, Kane stood motionless in the hospital hallway, his back against the white wall, looking through the glass into the room where Rosie sat on the bed, her small hand brushing across the white sheet, as though she were searching for something familiar and couldn't find it. 3 days, Wade said. "We've got 3 days before Detroit realizes she's been exposed. When Noelle's phone stops responding long enough, Morello will understand, and after that, everything changes." 3 days, 72 hours. The clock had started, and Kane stood between two roads. The old road he had walked for 13 years, the road of darkness and the kind of payment that costs everything except money, and another road he had never walked, a road he hadn't even known existed until he saw the drawing beneath his pillow, the drawing of a girl standing beside her brother before an open door, ready to step into the dark with him. 72 hours. No more, no less. And with every passing hour, the distance between Kane and collapse grew one step shorter. The second day of the 72 hours. Maeve arrived at the hospital at 9 o'clock that evening to begin her night shift, just as she had on every other night, just as she had walked this same path for the past 3 years. She changed her shoes in the staff room, the soft-soled kind she always wore because she knew that for many patients, even the sound of footsteps could feel like a threat. She opened her locker, and her hand stopped midway. On the shelf inside, right beside the coat she had left there the day before, was a dried flower, a lavender stem, exactly the kind she kept in the little vase on her desk in the nurse's station. Exactly. Beneath the flower was a folded white note, written in black ink, all in block letters, with no identifying mark. "Pretty, isn't it? Be careful it doesn't wither." Maeve read the line twice. Her hand shook, not a slight tremor, but real shaking, the kind she couldn't control, the kind that began in her fingers and spread up her arm, and then into her chest. Someone had entered the staff changing room. Someone knew what kind of flower she used. Someone wanted her to know they knew who she was, where she was, and what she was doing. She called the police. They came, took a report, photographed the flower and the note, asked her a few questions, then left. No fingerprints. No camera footage showing who had entered the changing room. No direct threat in the words. Only a compliment about the flower and a warning to take care of it. Not enough to constitute a crime. The system couldn't protect her, and Maeve realized, with a feeling so familiar it made her sick, that this wasn't the first time the system had abandoned her. 11 years earlier, when she was 16, when her mother had dragged her into a clinic and said, "My daughter has a problem," the system had stood there and nodded too. The doctor prescribed medication. Her mother smiled, and Maeve took medicine she didn't need for 2 years, because no one in that system asked her one simple question: "Do you really need this medication?" She sat alone in the staff room, staring at the dried flower on the table in front of her, and her mother's voice echoed in her mind, as clear as if the woman were sitting right across from her. "You always go looking for trouble." That voice was familiar. That voice had followed her for 11 years. Every time she did something the world said was too much. Every time she cared about someone, other people said was none of her business. Every time she tried to speak and was pushed back into silence, that voice said, "Give up. This isn't your fight. You're only a nurse. You can't save anyone. You couldn't even save yourself." Maeve sat there, and she almost believed it. Almost. Then she remembered Rosie's face at the clinic. The look on it when the girl's shoulders lowered each time Noelle left the room. The look on it when she picked up the pencil and drew the bird in the glass cage. She remembered that 11 years earlier, not one adult had said to her, "This isn't your fault." Not one person had walked through the clinic door and pulled her out. Not one person had kept her drawing and understood that it was a cry for help. And she looked at the dried flower on the table, looked at the words, "Be careful, it doesn't wither," and made her decision. She wouldn't let Rosie become another version of herself. She wouldn't let that 18-year-old girl grow up with a voice in her head saying, "You always go looking for trouble." She wouldn't walk away because someone had sent her a dried flower and a message. She picked up the flower, stood, took her coat, and for the first time since all of this began, she left the hospital by choice to find Kane Thornton. Not at the hospital, but at the place Wade had said he was staying, the safe room on the west side of the city that Kane used when he needed to disappear from the map. Maeve placed the dried flower on the table in front of Kane. She stood there with one hand clenched around the strap of her bag, shoulders straight though her fingers trembled, and looked directly into the gray eyes of the man all of Chicago wouldn't dare name aloud. "Your world is touching mine," she said. "I'm not asking you to explain. I'm asking you to keep her safe, and if you can't, I will." Kane looked at the dried flower on the table. Then he looked up at Maeve. "You know who I am," he said. "Aren't you afraid?" Maeve swallowed. "I am," she said, and her voice didn't pretend to be stronger than it was, "but I'm more afraid of walking away." Kane looked at her for a long moment. He had met hundreds of people in his life, people who feared him and pretended they didn't, people who didn't fear him because they were too foolish to understand that they should. But this was the first time he had met someone who was afraid, knew she was afraid, said plainly that she was afraid, and still stood there. He said nothing more. He only nodded, a nod heavier than any promise, then turned to Wade and began talking about increasing security for the treatment ward where Rosie was staying. Maeve left that room with her legs still shaking, but with her back straighter than it had been when she entered. She didn't know that inside the room, after she was gone, Kane picked up the dried flower, looked at it, then said only one sentence to Wade: "Find out who put this in her locker, and make sure that person understands the consequences." The last night before everything changed, the 63rd hour out of 72, Kane sat beside Rosie's bed in the treatment ward on the 5th floor, on the hard plastic chair the hospital provided for patients' families, the kind of chair never designed for anyone to sit in for more than an hour. Yet he had been sitting there since 10 o'clock that night. His suit was wrinkled. His tie had been removed at some point. His hands were clasped together on his knees, his head slightly bowed. The gray eyes the entire city feared were now red from lack of sleep, and heavy with something far heavier than exhaustion. Rosie was asleep, for the first time since the night of the shattered glass. Her face wasn't tense. There was no crease between her brows, no tight jaw, no hands clutching the bedsheet as though afraid she would be dragged away. She lay on her side, hair spread across the white pillow, breathing evenly, and she looked exactly 18, young, fragile, and far too innocent to have known the kind of pain she already had. Kane watched his sister sleeping and thought about 13 years. 13 years he had spent every day building one more wall, one more layer of protection, one more ring of control around her. And those 13 years had not prevented the worst thing from happening beneath his own roof, in the room he paid for, at the hands of the person he had brought inside with his own hands. The door opened softly. Maeve stepped in, wearing her soft-soled shoes, silent as always, a chart in her hand. She had come to check Rosie's heart rate, temperature, and blood pressure, the usual work every 4 hours. She looked at the monitor, wrote down the numbers, then turned and saw Kaine, the most powerful boss in Chicago, the man the FBI had watched for 5 years without touching, the man whose name was whispered in the dark with fear, was sitting in a cheap plastic chair in a public hospital, looking no different from a lost father who didn't know what to do next. Maeve stood by the door and hesitated. She should leave. This wasn't a time for conversation. This was the hour for the patient to sleep and the family to have quiet. But she didn't leave. She didn't know why. Perhaps because she understood that the man sitting in that chair didn't need a nurse. He needed someone who wouldn't judge him for 5 minutes. Kaine looked up. His eyes met hers in the dim hospital light, the kind of light turned down as low as possible so the patient could sleep, while still leaving enough brightness for the nurse to work. "I built all of this to protect her," Kaine said, his voice rough, quieter than usual, as though he were speaking more to himself than to Maeve. "But the most dangerous thing was the thing I brought home myself." Maeve didn't answer right away. She looked at Rosie sleeping, looked at the girl's small hand resting on the pillow, the same hand that only days earlier had clutched her knees and refused to let go. Then she looked back at Kaine. "You can't change the past," Maeve said, her voice gentle but not weak. "But you're sitting here, at 3 o'clock in the morning. That matters." Kaine looked at her, and in that moment, he wasn't a crime boss. She wasn't a nurse. They were only 2 people sitting beside the bed of an 18-year-old girl in the night. 2 people life had taught that this world isn't kind, yet both of them were still here, still choosing to be here, because someone needed them to be. No one said anything else. There was no need. Maeve pulled over the second plastic chair, one just as hard as the one Kaine was sitting in, and placed it on the other side of Rosie's bed. She sat down, 2 adults sitting on either side of a sleeping girl, in a cold white hospital room, in the middle of the Chicago night, while somewhere out there the 72-hour clock was still counting down. Morello was still waiting, and the world Kaine had built over 13 years was hanging by its thinnest thread. But inside this room, in this moment, none of that existed. There was only the even sound of Rosie's breathing, the soft beep-beep of the heart monitor, and 2 adults keeping watch over the sleep of the girl the entire underworld wanted to use as a piece on the board, though no one in that world understood that she wasn't a piece. She was the reason every game existed in the first place. They sat like that until morning. No one slept. No one spoke another word. And when the first light of the new day slipped through the curtain, Maeve rose, checked Rosie one last time, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped and turned back to look at Kaine. He was still sitting there, hands clasped together, looking at his sister. She said nothing. He said nothing. But both of them knew the night that had just passed had changed something between them that neither of them needed to name. The 70th hour. 2 hours remained before the window closed. Wade stood in the safe room on the west side of Chicago, facing Kaine, with a thick file in his hands, and only 2 choices left. "First option," Wade said, his voice as even as a man reading a weather report about a storm about to make landfall. "Handle Morello the old way. Fast. Clean. Within 48 hours. Detroit is no longer a problem. You keep your position. Keep your empire. Keep everything." He paused for a beat. "Second option. Hand everything to the FBI. All the evidence on Morello, on his network, on the deal with Noelle. Morello falls. Noelle loses her shield. But once the FBI opens Morello's file, they'll see the threads leading back to you. And they'll pull." Kaine sat behind the desk, both hands resting on the wooden surface, back straight, eyes fixed on the empty space between Wade and the wall behind him. On the desk, directly in front of him, lay the drawing of the bird in the glass cage that Maeve had kept from the clinic and given back through Wade, the drawing Rosie had made with colored pencils on white paper while waiting for her appointment. The small bird stood inside the glass cage. It could see the sky. It could see freedom, but it couldn't touch it. Kaine looked at that drawing, and he thought about the 2 roads. The first road was the road he had walked for 13 years. That road was as familiar as breathing. He knew how to walk it because he had built it with his own hands, brick by brick, sleepless night by sleepless night, name by name erased from the map. Choosing that road meant Morello disappeared. The empire remained standing, and Kaine Thornton stayed the name all of Chicago whispered after 9 o'clock at night. But choosing that road also meant Rosie would grow up, knowing her brother was the kind of man who solved problems through darkness. She would live in the fortress he built, safe, protected. But every time she looked at him, she would know, and that knowledge would become another glass cage, larger, thicker, more transparent. She would see freedom but never touch it, because her brother would still be the one holding the key from outside. The second road did not yet exist. He had never walked it. He didn't even know where it led. He only knew it began with letting go of everything he had held for 13 years and stepping into a place he could not control. Kane picked up the drawing, looked at the bird, looked at the glass cage. Then he set the drawing down, lifted his phone, and called his lawyer. The call lasted 40 minutes. The lawyer spoke a great deal. Kane spoke very little. The terms negotiated with the FBI were clear. Kane would turn over all the evidence on Morello, on the Detroit network, on the arrangement with Noel. In exchange, he would receive a lighter sentence, financial penalties, and supervised release instead of prison, and he would keep guardianship of Rosie. The lawyer fell silent for a moment after hearing the demand, then said, "You'll lose 70% of your assets. The casinos, the real estate, the related investments, all of it." "I only need to keep one thing," Kane said. The lawyer didn't ask what that one thing was. He didn't need to. Within an hour of the call, the news began to spread. Not in the newspapers, not online, but in the underworld, where rumor moved faster than light and killed more surely than bullets. Kane's phone rang. An old associate, a man who had worked with him since the early years, a man who had sat at the same table with him when he was only 22 and trying to control the South Harbor. "You think you can wash your hands and walk away?" The voice on the other end was cold, sharp, carrying 13 years of loyalty now burning to ash. Kane listened. He didn't interrupt. Then he answered, his voice even, neither rising nor falling. "I'm not washing my hands. I'm burning down the field, but I'm choosing what I plant again." The other man ended the call. Kane set the phone down and looked at Wade. Wade stood by the door, his back against the wall, his arms folded across his chest, expression unreadable, but his eyes held something Kane had never seen in 13 years. Not the old kind of respect, not the loyalty of a soldier, but something closer to real regard. "Are you sure?" Wade asked. "There's no way back." Kane looked at the drawing of the bird on the desk. "I don't want to go back," he said. "For the first time in my life." Wade nodded. He said nothing more. He took out his phone and began making calls, arranging what had to be arranged, contacting the people who had to be contacted, closing the doors that needed closing and opening doors that had never been opened before. 48 hours later, Vince Morello was arrested at a restaurant in a Detroit suburb at 7 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of eating pho, by 12 FBI agents who had been waiting there since 5. Noelle received the news in the temporary hotel room her lawyer had rented for her. The only shield between her and the justice system had just been torn away. She sat on the hotel bed, staring at her phone, and for the first time since the night that 12-year-old girl had stood outside the locked house, she understood what it meant to be the one left outside with no one opening the door. And Kane, he lost 70% of his wealth. 3 casinos, 2 neighborhoods, the network he had built over 13 years. His name changed from the name the whole city whispered to the name the whole city talked about. He was no longer the boss. He was the man who had burned down everything he owned. But when he walked into the hospital room that afternoon, and Rosie looked up, and her hand reached out to catch his sleeve just as it had every time before, Kane understood that what he had kept weighed more than everything he had lost. And for the first time since that alley on the south side 13 years earlier, Kane Thornton stepped out of the darkness. Not because he had stopped being afraid, but because he feared something else far more, that the bird inside the glass cage would never fly. The courtroom held nothing soft within it. White walls, hard wooden benches, fluorescent lights shining straight down and leaving no shadow where anyone could hide. Everything in that room had been designed for a single purpose: truth, whether people wanted to hear it or not. Rosie sat beside Kane on their side of the room, her feet not yet touching the floor because the bench was too high, her hands resting in her lap, her fingers twisted tightly together. She wore the white blouse Maeve had helped her choose that morning. Simple, clean, making no effort to impress anyone. Kane sat next to her, back straight, face unreadable. But beneath the table, his left hand was clenched into a fist on his knee, and every few minutes he glanced sideways at his sister, quick, almost unconsciously, as though he feared that if he didn't look, she would disappear. Across from them, Noelle Ashford sat beside her team of lawyers. She wore a pale gray dress, her hair neatly tied back, no jewelry, no red lipstick, nothing left of the woman who had once stood in the gala hall at the Peninsula Chicago, with a champagne glass in her hand, and a smile placed exactly where it needed to be. She looked modest, looked fragile, looked like the victim of a misunderstanding. It was Noelle's final performance, and she played it perfectly. The hearing began. Lawyers on both sides presented their arguments. Evidence was read. Testimony was entered into the record. June sat in the witness chair, one hand gripping the edge of her shirt, eyes straight ahead, recounting what she had seen over those weeks inside the penthouse. Maeve sat in the back, spine straight, the drawing of the bird tucked inside her coat pocket, waiting for her turn if she was called. Then the judge looked toward Rosie. She asked, her voice gentle, not out of pity, but because she understood that for some people, even a question can already be too much. "Would you like to say anything? You are not required to speak." The whole courtroom fell silent. Kane turned toward Rosie. He wanted to say you don't have to do this, but he didn't, because he saw his sister's eyes. Those were not the eyes of the girl who had sat in the corner of the penthouse that night, empty and gone from reality. These eyes were here, completely here. Rosie stood. The entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing. She stepped out from the bench, each step slow, each step heavy, as though the floor were trying to pull her back, and still she moved forward. She didn't look at Noelle. She didn't look at the lawyers. She looked at the judge, only the judge, because that was the one person in the room she chose to speak to. When she reached the judge's bench, Rosie didn't open her mouth right away. She placed a small sheet of paper on the desk, folded into quarters and slightly wrinkled from having been held in her hand all through the night. The judge opened it. A drawing, sketched in pencil on the back of an old book page, the lines unsteady but clear. A room, shards of glass on the floor. A small figure sitting in the corner with both arms around her knees. A taller figure standing in the middle of the room, a phone in one hand, and at the lower edge of the drawing, an open door, but no one walking through it. The judge looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she lifted her eyes to Rosie. The courtroom had gone so quiet that the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead could be heard. Then Rosie opened her mouth. Her voice was soft, trembling. Each word came out as though she were pulling one nail after another from the door she had never opened in 13 years. "She knew what I was afraid of," Rosie said. And she used it. The courtroom shook with silence, not shaken by noise, but by the weight of what had just been spoken by someone the world had grown used to hearing nothing from. Rosie swallowed. Her hand gripped the edge of the judge's bench, her fingers pale, but she didn't stop. "I don't lie," she went on, her voice still shaking but each word clearer than the one before. "I stayed silent because I was afraid, but today I choose not to be afraid anymore." Across the room, Noelle had sat motionless through all of Rosie's words. Her face had held the same calm mask she had worn for the past 2 years. But when Rosie finished that last sentence, when the whole courtroom turned to look at her, when the judge's gaze moved from the drawing to Noelle's face, something inside her broke apart. Noelle shot to her feet, her chair scraping backward, and her voice cut through the silence of the courtroom like a knife. "That girl needs treatment. All of you are being manipulated." Her lawyer grabbed at her sleeve. She jerked away. "Don't you understand? I'm the only one who cares about her. I'm the only one." The judge struck the gavel. Once. The sharp crack of wood against wood rang out, and Noelle stopped in the middle of her sentence, her mouth still open, but no more words came out. She looked around the courtroom and realized that the outburst had destroyed everything. The performance of the humble victim in the pale gray dress had tried to build. Everyone in the room, the judge, the jury, the lawyers, even the people sitting in the back rows, had just seen the real face behind the mask, and that face looked nothing like a victim. Rosie turned and walked back to her seat. Her legs were still steady, her back still straight, but when she sat down beside Kane, her whole body began to shake, like the last trembling vibrations of a string that had just been struck. Kane held her. He didn't say anything. He only held her. And Rosie whispered into the shoulder of his jacket, so softly that only Kane could hear. 5 words she had kept inside herself for 13 years. "I don't want to be silent anymore." Kane tightened his arms around her. He wanted to say so many things. Wanted to say he was sorry. wanted to say he should have been there, wanted to say he had been wrong. But he knew that in this moment, Rosie didn't need him to speak. She only needed him here. So he said only one sentence. "You were braver than anyone I've ever known." The hearing ended. The sentence was read. Noelle Ashford was found guilty of harming a protected person and of collaborating with a criminal organization. As she was led away through the rear hallway, she turned her head to look back. Her eyes searched for Rosie. But Kane had already stepped into the space between them, his broad back blocking the line of sight completely. And Rosie never saw that look. She didn't need to see it. The courtroom door closed, and on this side of that door, the girl who had never been able to speak a full sentence in front of a stranger had just stood before a room full of people and spoken the truth in her own voice. Maeve sat in the last row, her eyes wet, one hand still resting on her coat pocket where the drawing of the bird lay inside. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. That drawing had spoken for her long ago. And today, the bird inside the glass cage had opened its beak for the first time. In the months after the trial, the penthouse on the 47th floor changed in ways no one looking from the outside could have recognized. Nothing was repaired or redecorated. No new furniture, no fresh paint on the walls. The change lived in the air. The silence in that home was still there, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of a place learning how to breathe again. Slowly, carefully, one breath at a time. Kane began eating breakfast with Rosie every day, not because anyone told him to, but because he realized that in 13 years, he had never once sat at the same table with his sister long enough to watch her finish a bowl of cereal. He sat there, drinking coffee, and said nothing. Because Rosie didn't need him to speak. She needed him there. That was all. He began learning how to draw. Very badly. So badly that Rosie looked at his first drawing, tilted her head, then turned her face away, and Kane could have sworn he saw the corner of her mouth lift, if only for a second. He drew more, every picture terrible. And each time Rosie looked, and then looked away with that same small lift at the corner of her mouth, and Kane realized he would gladly draw 1,000 ugly pictures if each one could buy him a moment like that. Rosie began to speak. Not all at once. Not much. One word here. 2 words there. Water, when she wanted a glass of water. Okay, when Wade asked if she wanted to go for a walk. Every word that came out of her mouth was like a small door opening. Only a crack. Only enough for a ray of light to slip through. But every ray of light mattered. Then, one evening, Kane was standing in the kitchen washing dishes. For the first time in 31 years of life, he stood at a sink with his hands full of soap bubbles, and he had no idea whether he was doing it the right way, but he kept washing because he had dismissed the entire old staff and hadn't hired anyone new yet, and because there were some things he needed to do with his own hands, even if he didn't know how. Rosie stood beside him, leaning against the kitchen counter, watching her brother struggle with a plate. And then she spoke, her voice soft and calm, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "You're washing it wrong." Kane nearly dropped the plate. He turned toward his sister and saw her mouth curve just slightly. Not a smile, not yet, but a small ripple across water he had believed had been frozen forever for 13 years. He turned his face away, because his eyes were burning, and because Kane Thornton didn't cry in front of anyone, even if that person was the only one in the world he would willingly cry for. Maeve began to visit, not as a nurse checking heart rate and blood pressure anymore, but as a friend carrying a new pack of colored pencils she had bought at the stationery store down the street. Rosie took the pencils, opened the pack, looked at each one, then began to draw. She made a picture for Maeve, 2 hands, like the picture she had once taped to the refrigerator months earlier, the one Kane had walked past every day, without ever stopping to look. But this picture was different. In the old one, the 2 hands clung tightly to each other, the larger hand holding on, the smaller hand grasping back. In the new one, both hands were open, not gripping, not clinging, just open, side by side, like 2 people standing beside one another and choosing to stay, not because they were being held there. Maeve held the drawing and understood. That afternoon, Maeve sat in the living room reading while Rosie drew by the window, and Kane moved back and forth between the kitchen and his office. No one said much, but the 3 of them were in the same space, without any of them feeling the need to explain why they were there, and that was the closest thing to family that Penthouse had ever known. When Maeve left, Rosie waited until the elevator doors had closed, then walked over to Kane and handed him a small piece of paper. Kane opened it. Rosie's handwriting, familiar pencil strokes. She's good. Don't ruin it. Kane looked at the note, then looked at his sister. Rosie had already turned away and was walking back to her room, not waiting for a reaction, because she had already said everything she needed to say. That night, before going to bed, Rosie handed Kane another small note. This time it held only one question. Are you a good person? Kane read that question while standing in the doorway of his sister's room, and he knew that any answer lacking honesty would close the door Rosie had only just begun to open. So he told the truth. I'm a man trying to become a good person, he said. There's a difference. Rosie looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded, once, lightly, as though that answer was enough for today. She closed her bedroom door. She didn't lock it. 2 years later. Rosie was 20 years old. The small gallery occupied the ground floor of an old building in Lincoln Park. Not the kind of gallery with champagne and business cards, just a white-painted space, with worn wooden floors, and natural light falling in through large windows. The foundation Kane had established after the trial organized this exhibition, a modest showing for young people who had lived through things no one their age should ever have to endure, and Rosie was the one who hung the first painting on the wall. There were 4 paintings on display. The first, a house with a closed door, no windows, and a small figure standing inside. The second, the bird in the glass cage, able to see the sky but unable to touch it. The third, 2 open hands side by side, not holding, only there. And the fourth, the last, the largest, the bird in flight. Its wings spread wide across a sky without limits. Below it, the glass cage lay on the ground, shattered into 1,000 pieces, glinting beneath the sunlight like the last tears slowly drying away. The bird wasn't looking down. It was looking ahead. The crowd wasn't large. A few dozen people, mostly foundation staff, a few local reporters, a few families whose children were being supported by the foundation. Rosie stood beside her painting, one hand lightly holding the edge of her shirt, not entirely comfortable, but not hiding either. She had learned that courage doesn't mean not being afraid. Courage means being afraid and standing here anyway. A little girl, about 7 or 8 years old, came with her mother, slipped away from her hand, and walked over to stand beside Rosie. The child looked at the painting of the bird, then looked up at Rosie, and her small hand lightly caught Rosie's sleeve, exactly the way Rosie had once held on to Kane's sleeve during the nights she had been most afraid. Are you still scared? The girl whispered. Rosie looked down at her. Then she crouched slowly, until her eyes were level with the child's. Yes, Rosie said, her voice soft, steady, no longer trembling. But now I get to choose what I do with that fear. The little girl looked at Rosie, then back at the painting of the bird flying, and nodded, as though at 7 or 8 years old, she had already understood something many adults spend their whole lives never learning. Farther away, standing near the entrance, Kane watched the scene. He wore an ordinary shirt, no suit, no expensive watch, nothing like the man all of Chicago had once called the boss. Beside him, Maeve stood quietly, and his hand held hers naturally, without awkwardness, as though that hand had belonged there for a long time and both of them had only just realized it. Wade stood at the door, his back against the wooden frame, his arms folded across his chest, his face still unreadable just as it had been for 13 years. But when his eyes met Kane's, he gave the smallest nod, only once. And inside that nod lived 13 long years, 13 years of darkness, and for the first time, something that looked like light. Rosie rose to her feet and looked at her brother from across the room. She picked up a pencil, took a small piece of paper from the reception desk, and sketched quickly. A tower, tall, strong, like the painting she had once made of her brother months earlier. But this time, the tower had windows, and in the windows, there was light. Sometimes, the strongest people aren't the ones who build the highest walls, but the ones who dare to open the windows. Kane Thornton had built an empire at every cost, and through 13 sleepless years, but his true legacy didn't live in casinos or contracts worth millions of dollars. It lived in the painting of a girl he had almost never truly seen. And Rosie, the girl who once couldn't speak a single word, had found the most powerful voice in the world, not through sound, but through the choice to tell her own story. Thank you all for listening to today's story. If you believe that real love isn't measured by power but by sacrifice, please leave a like on this video. Please share this story with the people you think need to hear it. because sometimes the right story at the right moment can change the way someone sees their own life. And if you'd like to stay with us on the journey of telling many more stories like this every day, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any video. How did this story make you feel? Do you think Rosie was right to choose to speak up? Do you think Kane deserved a second chance? We would truly love to hear what you feel deep in your hearts, because every comment you leave is a great source of encouragement that helps us continue creating stories that touch hearts every day. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days filled with calm. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.